How lawyers engage in the climate and environmental justice space. So Melissa Muroff will describe the roles lawyers play in the climate and environmental justice space other than through litigation and compliance enforcement for large corporations. She will detail ways in which communities and small nonprofits can engage and collaborate with lawyers. She's collected an impressive list of nonprofit legal organizations that largely do not litigate or support corporate interests. She will survey those organizations, highlighting the ways they work with local communities and grassroots nonprofits outside the courtroom. And so I welcome you and hand it over to you to give the presentation now. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. This photograph I took, it is in the county where I work. So I'm going to mention in 8 seconds what I did, what my recent position was. But this is one of the locations in our county that we were focused on. So why we are here. We're here, as Nikki said, to explore this question. Aside from primary litigation, aside from the lawyers that do primary litigation, what are nonprofit climate lawyers doing and how can we engage with them? But I also want to take a minute just to provide a little bit of context as to why I even did this research in the first place. I've been a lawyer for a while. I've worked as a healthcare lobbyist. I owned a landscape architecture, civil engineering firm that created like green stormwater infrastructure and landscapes on structure, urban water resources strategies. And then so that was very ecologically focused. And then most recently, I served as chief of environmental crimes in the DA's office in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. So, and the focus, as I kind of indicated there, was on environmental justice areas. So now, as I'm growing my own consultancy, I want to leverage that climate legal experience with business management experience. And I'm also really interested in understanding how other lawyers in the climate space are operating. I want to network with them. I'd like to collaborate with them. But the caveat was the one thing I've learned across my entire career is I hate the courtroom. I do not like litigating. I despise it. So consequently, I didn't pay too much attention to those. I haven't in my own research paid that much attention to the nonprofit legal organizations that really emphasize litigation. So as I've been reviewing and reaching out to various, and also frankly applying for jobs at various nonprofit organizations, I kind of have come to appreciate these organizations within the context of like five roles, I guess, if you count litigation. And by that, I meant like the kinds of firms I think of or organizations that I think of that do primary litigation, which I'm not going to address in this presentation, are like the National Resources Defense Council, Sierra Club, Earth Justice, Clean Air Council, our Children's Trust, that's kind of where I categorize those organizations. But that said, there are obviously organizations that I would put in these four categories. They have roles that kind of bleed across these are not obviously bright lines between these four groups. And I also want to underscore that virtually all of them will do issue advocacy like lobbying, policy analysis, policy development, some amount of legal research or legal strategy research. So that skill set kind of undergirds all of these organizations. So let's dive into it and talk about the first category. These organizations, again, a lot of lawyers in these nonprofits, maybe not exclusively, but they, in addition to doing that deep dive policy analysis and research on their issues, they focus on communities, nonprofits. They will provide technical legal education on the issues that they're championing. And they also work to provide that like soft skills campaign training on like advocacy skills, messaging skills. They help help nonprofits and communities navigate that advocacy space, which can be challenging when you're dealing with technical climate issues. Sorry, I meant to I meant to move this slide down. So the way I've structured this presentation is I'm going to have a representative example of firms that fall into each category. So the ones that are underlined are the firms that I kind of want to highlight. So Earthworks does everything that I just said. They facilitate community organizing, provide education, but they have this band of field investigators that go all over the United States. They have optical gas imaging cameras, OGIs, they call them, right? Yeah, OGIs, optical gas imaging cameras that allow them to capture an image of oil and gas air pollution, which oftentimes is invisible to the naked eye. So they have been capturing these images for years all over the country and have a catalog of all of these sites since 2014. And that kind of data can be really powerful for community groups and frontline communities who are trying to push back on corporate polluters. So I thought that was kind of an interesting twist. And Just Solutions, I also liked, and they stood out to me a little bit too, because they're working with, policymakers. They're working with government officials, and really at the statewide level, they're elevating the emphasis on climate justice, and they will work with states to provide statewide convenings on trainings on climate issues and climate justice issues, as opposed to, working more at the grassroots level. And you can take another look at these. It's kind of de rigueur for these organizations to educate using white papers and toolkits and workshops. So that's the first group. The second group of organizations emphasize support for litigation or support for law firms, as opposed to being the lead filer for a lawsuit. So I'm going to talk about almost all of these because I think they're all super interesting. But the Legal Sustainability Network, which is the first one, is the only one on this list that focuses on the private sector. They support a platform for convening law firms to share ideas and talk about develop standards for the legal profession in the sustainability space, which I liked, and I wished I knew about them like much earlier. There are two organizations on this list that also right now, especially, I think are doing something critical, and I hope there are more out there. And that's the Movement Strategy Center #2, and I'll show you the ones on the second page. But these two organizations they re-grant funds to nonprofit legal organizations, public interest lawyers, and community groups that are trying to advance or enforce climate laws. And increasingly, funding is just becoming obviously a crisis situation for nonprofits. So I think I'd love to see that. They also will provide legal analysis and legal support, but they will provide strategic support, organizational support, so that the business side of these nonprofit organizations or public interest firms can thrive. The Movement Strategy Center will even be a fiscal sponsor. The second organization in that space is the Foundation #7 for International Law and Environment. And they do the same. They will re-grant funds. So I was really looking for any organizations that would help with the funding of these legal organizations, these nonprofit organizations. I'm going to hop back up here though. Public Citizen, full disclosure, okay, I applied for a job with Public Citizen because they are launching, and I hope they get it off the ground, but it's still jury's out. They are launching a initiative, I think they refer to it as, an initiative to support district attorneys' offices and attorneys general offices that are interested in filing criminal climate cases. By and large, I don't really know of any, or maybe, I don't know. It is normal for climate lawsuits to be civil cases. And then you have to deal with the federal jurisdiction. It's a whole thing, and that's not worth discussing, and you're about to undertake. So, but if a criminal case is filed, that is a state action and it stays a state action. It's super challenging to try to sue criminally a fossil fuel company. But Public Citizen is trying to create an initiative where they're providing legal theories of the case. They're providing all of the research going back decades on fossil fuel companies. They are trying to recruit private sector, like hotshot litigators, to work pro bono, or Public Citizens would fund them to support these state attorney offices. So if that works, if there's a state office that goes for it, that will be something to watch. And then on the civil side, State Energy and Environmental Impact Center number 4, they also provide state attorneys in their climate litigations. It's just to to tackle these large corporates is absolutely overwhelming for even attorneys general offices. I had some experience with that in the DA's office, and it's you get swamped by these corporates. And then the only other one I wanted to point out was number 8, the Environmental Law Alliance. And I like this one because it emphasized the scientific support provided to not public interest lawyers, whether it's NRDC or whatever it is. But it's so important to have a solid scientific foundation for these cases, and to be able to interpret the federal regulatory like cobweb that is written for engineers by engineers, and it can be really challenging to untangle. So I liked to see that anytime I was seeing collaboration of scientists and lawyers, I thought that was really important. Is there anything in the first or second that raised any questions or made you think about something that is a good add-on?
How would a normal, let's just use the KCCC. How would the KCCC find out about these different organizations that would help them if they wish to pursue some legal matter?
You know, that's a great question. It is, it's probably, I would say 2 things, and it's probably what you would do anyway, is talk to talk to the lawyers that you're now working with and ask them for suggestions in this space, and suggest for whatever the issue is that you want to focus, whatever your question is or need is. There could be, if there's a local legal aid organization, they may have some recommendations. And I say may because the environmental law is so regulatory driven that it's often thought of differently than either certainly than criminal law. But I don't know. I would think maybe a local legal aid clinic may have some recommendations. And then Googling, I think some of these I knew because I worked in the space, and I've worked with a number of nonprofit organizations that were kind of either legal organizations or law adjacent since in my professional career. So I just kind of knew them, but there was no clearinghouse really. Well, I shouldn't say that. There is, and we're going to get to it in a minute,
Okay.
depending on what your need is. So I'm going to put a pin in that. The next category is organizations that don't as much emphasize enforcing the existing climate laws. I'm using climate laws as kind of a catch-all, but are actually aggressively looking to create new laws and make it as easy as possible for jurisdictions to adopt them. So I'm not going to talk about each of these individually. Like I said before, the ones that are underlined are the ones I'm going to highlight because you can read as I'm talking. But the Environmental Integrity Project, I stumbled upon, and I love these guys. This organization was founded by former EPA lawyers, and consequently, they can read the very complicated, I don't want to say tea leaves. They can navigate the really complex world of determining whether a permittee, a polluter, I'm going to call them polluters because they have a permit to pollute, whether a polluter is violating its permit, and whether there's any need to investigate further. But what they do to kind of move the ball forward is they work with communities. And so aside from, investigating and exposing pollution in support of local communities and nonprofits, they also will work with communities to help them leverage their existing zoning laws, which is like one of the most powerful tools communities have to keep polluting entities from getting a building permit and setting up shop in their community. And they'll also work with them. They've also drafted a series of model zoning ordinances for communities to adopt so that it's much more difficult for polluters to be able to get approved to build in their jurisdictions. Really cool organization and just super surgical in the way that they operate that way. Number 3 is the only regional entity that I included because they're in the Midwest, and I thought they might be of interest to you, but I wasn't sure. But they work with policymakers to craft laws and also, lobby and advance good climate law. But I just wanted to call them out because they are a Midwest regional entity. And then I'm going to hop to the next slide. These last two, I love actually. So the first one is a collaboration of lawyers and professionals that have drafted over 2,500 model laws. They have a great website, 2,500 model laws that can be, at all levels of government. And their focus is predominantly reducing fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions. That's a really great tool. And the Sabin Center, likewise, is a fantastic tool. Your lawsuit is probably actually in their catalog of climate litigation. That's where I go, the Sabin Center, to find out what's the status of climate litigation, who's getting sued. They just track all of that around the country. But they also have a catalog of model laws and regulations and environmental justice bills, which is always something I was looking for, is what organizations were elevating environmental justice in addition to laws that were addressing pollution and ESG violations. So are there any questions or comments on this group on this kind of role that nonprofits can play? Okay. Now, here's our last one. Law clinics and pro bono. And this is,
Melissa,
sorry.
The Sabin Center was Columbia University. With Trump and trying to get rid of all of the climate stuff, what's happening with the Sabin Center and Columbia? Because Columbia was one that folded.
Yep, they did. And you know what? I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
That's a great question.
Okay.
I've used that climate litigation database in the past. And so I knew about it. And because I was working on these other, um, I was drilling down on these other ones. I didn't actually go to that website,
Okay.
when I did this. So I'm gonna hope and pray that nothing, I mean, I don't know how that's funded though. Obviously that would be a target, I would imagine.
Okay.
Not, I will check after we finish on this. That's probably the first thing I'm gonna check because that would break my heart. Okay, so this, Nikki, goes to your question. Law clinics and pro bono. And by law clinics, what I'm really referring to are the law schools that have law clinics. And I only listed those law clinics that, even though they're based in a particular university, they do service the country. They will provide support to organizations across the country. So there are quite a few organizations like Lawyers for Good Government, which you identified before, that support a platform, like a matchmaking platform, to match lawyers who are interested in providing pro bono services to nonprofits, communities, other organizations in need of legal assistance. So the organization, so to your point, I didn't, you should be able, you can access these websites. Yeah, you can access these websites either as a lawyer or a potential client and describe your need. I didn't go through like a mock process on any one of these websites, but they're matchmaking platforms, and that's Lawyers for Good Government, and that is Green Pro Bono. And on the next page, it's Trust Law, which is a Thomson Reuters product, and Pro Bono Net. And the Environmental Law Institute also has a pro bono clearinghouse. ELI is like a really great resource for lawyers and environmental professionals. They kind of focus on policy. They do draft model laws as well. But they have this additional service for matchmaking. So in that respect, I think you could use these clearinghouses, matchmaking platforms to even just to learn about other. You're not really learning about other nonprofits though. You're learning about, but you could be learning about other public interest law firms who want to work for nothing, So it's it's an avenue. And then I mentioned Harvard's Law Clinic and Vermont Laws Law Clinic. Both do, environmental justice work, but they will serve entities all over the country. I know the Vermont Law Clinic has been providing legal support to St. Croix in the Virgin Islands for quite a while. So they will provide services anywhere. And that's obviously a fantastic opportunity for law students to learn lawyering and obviously gain technical scientific knowledge about climate issues. The other thing that, I mentioned Pro Bono Net before. They're also listed in the organizations that support other law firm support litigation, because, and I wanted to flag them because they were one of the few that they call out this searchable library of a lot of different resources. Now it's mostly training for students and pro bono lawyers, but it's just kind of like a next level that goes beyond just the matchmaking, to providing all kinds of training, model briefs, and so on. So now, actually, I wanted to go back to Good Government, Lawyers for Good Government, because Susan, right? Is that your name? Did you say they've developed a litigation like division?
Jenny.
Oh, Jenny, I'm so
Yeah,
sorry.
that's totally fine. Yes, they have. And they also were, so the way that we connected to them I think they must have reached out to all of the IRA grant recipients whose funds were frozen, but they had an intake form that they were distributing widely to try and collect as much information as possible on the funding freezes that were happening. And then they use those intake forms to determine who would be the best representatives for for advocating against the funding freezes and terminations. And they're also hosting monthly like office hour calls to help all of the funded projects organizations navigate what's happening right now, which has been an amazing support.
Yeah, wow. And I bet, so going back up here, so I would need to add them into this category. So they could even do things like legal research to support the primary litigators, write amicus briefs. One of the organizations, I don't know if it would be Lawyers for Good Government, but I think the Environmental Law Alliance, they will source like expert witnesses who are scientists to support public interest lawyers and support their cases. So I'll have to make them number 9 in the law firm litigation support. That's great to hear. They're an interesting, that whole world of matching the lawyers with the clients is, I suspect that's going to get further developed.
Yeah,
Even.
it is. I have learned a ton being part of this process, and it is, and I didn't know that groups like that existed before.
Yeah, and for class action lawsuit in particular, the support needed just to manage that case is colossal, I imagine. Okay, so if there are no other questions on the organizations in this space, then I'm going to hop to my honorable mentions, who I thought were so cool, but they didn't fit in any category. And the first organization, no, I think I learned about responsible contracting. I think I learned about it on a CLE. So the lawyers have to take continuing legal education courses. I was going to say I thought I learned about it through a pro bono, Green Pro Bono, which is one of the organizations in the last group, but it wasn't. But this is a nonprofit, but what they do is they draft model clauses and some guidance and policy, but model clauses to incorporate into commercial contracts that kind of protect human rights and the environment. And largely those clauses are like due diligence clauses typically. And so anyway, they are trying to beef up contracts to defend human rights and and the environment so that the corporate side can be better actors. So that's a really cool catalog. Good Energy Project is called, I think there's like, they have a little, I read in the various things I read about them, they're called like Hollywood's climate storyteller, but they're not exclusively lawyers. Good Energy Project is not staffed exclusively by lawyers, but they do like bring on lawyers to for their deliverable, and their deliverable is for their consulting. They consult to movie makers, filmmakers, script writers to incorporate like responsible climate messages into storylines and to help elevate, like to work with them so that they could actually create a really great movie around climate issues. So anyway, they're really cool. And you can get on the website, which probably they give kind of examples of what they've done. But I love that, and I appreciated that they incorporated the legal element in their storytelling. And then, if I could ever work for As You Sow, I would really do it. This organization is tough and scrappy, and what it does is really hard, I think. But they they're fundamentally working to advance shareholder rights in the corporate sector. They're a nonprofit, and they will identify or find shareholders, but identify or find shareholders who have enough standing, and standing may not be the proper term, but they own enough shares where that shareholder can submit a proposal for a vote at the general annual meeting, right? But to get a proposal through the process, through corporate approval and past the SEC various requirements is a huge deal, particularly when the proposal is something the corporation does not want to do, like make disclosures on how it's handling its waste tires, or gosh, what other one? There are a series of them, but disclosures on their ESG performance, or disclosures on human rights, human rights issues in their like factories in other countries. So sometimes what they do requires litigation, but what they're really trying to do is leverage their shareholder tools in the proxy season, which is the season leading up to the annual votes. And consequently, what they consider a win is when they can negotiate with the executives in the corporation and other investors to come to an agreement, an amicable agreement, where the corporation, basically determines it'll do the right thing just because it has to, because the shareholder movement is now strong enough that they can't do anything but that. So they are a really interesting organization. I think that work is really hard, but incredibly like rewarding in a lot of ways. So that's my other honorable mention. I hope that made sense. But so I didn't call this a group in particular because these are the stragglers, but they were just cool and I wanted to share them. So then if I kind of think through all of that, and this is really more for discussion, but I was then digesting, what I've kind of come to appreciate of these organizations. How do regular people work with them? And what do you leverage them for? And I think, the first clear tool is these are organizations, it really benefits them if they are going to lawmakers, if they are advocating on issues, having real world people who are being harmed, who live in that jurisdiction, is a really, really powerful thing. And that's what the nonprofits and the grassroots groups have to offer. That's essential. And I think that like the Category 1 organization that helps with capacity building and community organizing and education and advocacy, they can be really powerful to help create a movement. So that's one. I mean, I don't know. I almost want to be quiet here because I think most of this is pretty self-explanatory, and I'm wondering what your takeaway is. And where you see needs in not only for your organization, but just in the community, and gaps or connections. I don't know. How do you interpret all of this?
Anybody have any questions? So you can, as I said, if you use the raise hand, you move Tim. See, you moved right to the top there.
Okay, well, I'm sure these are all important, worthwhile organizations worthy of support. And as myself, a person who engages in one of my most important ways in supporting organizations financially, I'm not sure what to do with your list because there's so many. I already support a number of different organizations, only one of which was on your list, which was the Lawyers for good government. So would you focus in on any particular ones that you would suggest? Other than Lawyers for Good Government? I would also say I'm in this space, although beyond environmental. I'm aware of Democracy Forward
Mhm.
and also support their work. So can you provide me any guidance on what direction I might take other than what I've already done?
Yeah. You know, and this is, I'm now projecting my sense of need. I think if I were to internalize that question, and if I were going to think through where I would want to put my contribution, um, I think one of the things I would be interested in exploring a little more deeply than I could for this presentation, it are the two organizations that are re-granting funds to organizations and building their, to help build their capacity and support their missions. I I don't know that I would for sure write a check there, but I would really want to understand. That seems to be something that can be challenging for nonprofits, is the funds just to keep the organization operating, as opposed to um, program, funds that are tied to a program. So that's kind of um, one of the places that I would look. The thing about the the platforms, the pro bono platforms, um, I feel like, I don't know, but because private sector lawyers engage with these guys like Pro Bono Net, Trust Law, presumably Lawyers for Good Government and Screen Pro Bono. Like I was on a CLE for Green Pro Bono. So anytime like you're engaging with the private law lawyers, I figure you probably can get donations from those guys, I don't know, but it's the other organizations up here that I feel like are the scrappiest. And so my thought is, like, those organizations that maybe these community organizing ones that really work in the trenches and that maybe have that are present in your community, that would be my other thought. The ones that are yeah, that maybe would have, I would think these might have the greater need. So I guess that would be the way I would think through it for myself.
Susan?
Uh, Thank you very much, Melissa, for all the work you're putting into this. This is just so critical. All these projects are important, I think, but of course, the vast majority of people who are being adversely impacted by the climate crisis are in developing nations. You had a few organizations that are working on that. Of course, the US now, under the current administration, is not only polluting a lot more, but we've withdrawn from our contribution to the Green Climate Fund that the folks at the COP agreed to a few years ago. And are there any firms that have some lawyers that are working on the various international and national laws that might, act on that? I know international
Private
law,
sector?
I mean, nonprofits,
Oh,
that
nonprofit.
yeah, yeah. Like, for example, to try and get our contribution back up. I don't know if there's a legal case for that. I don't know if internationally, Ron would know more about that. He wrote a book called Carbon Criminals. Anyway, yeah, any thoughts on that?
I don't know.
Welcome. Thanks.
Okay.
I think I'm not smart enough to answer that question, other than to tag, I'm not, other than to tag, there was one that came to my mind. I think the Foundation for International Law
Um,
kind of, that one kind of, I mean, that's different than, only because to align climate finance with Paris Agreement. But that said, I don't think there's any jurisdiction that this organization would have to impact the current administration's decisions on, you were talking about impact the current administration's decisions on funding that's being withdrawn from international environmental causes. I think those lawsuits have to happen internally. So I don't think, yeah, they would probably, I mean, I think the slow and steady movement of the state attorneys are probably one of the best tools we're having to keep the federal government in check in that regard. I don't know how that would impact the USAID fund. No, I guess it would still be a domestic lawsuit though, I think. And it becomes like a constitutional question. I think that how that the administration does not have the right to impound funds that have already been, you know what I mean? It becomes like an issue between the two branches, a constitutional issue between the two branches, I think. I'm not, but this is outside of my narrow realm of knowledge.
Absolutely. I mean, they're already violating international trade agreements. So not surprising, they're violating international agreements about climate, including helping to fund the developing nations in their attempts to cope with all that we're,
For sure.
forcing
All that
them.
we're dumping.
Yeah,
But,
exactly.
to your point, domestically, and to maybe this goes to your question, the organizations that are taking the lead for frontline communities in like Houston, Louisiana, and in my own hometown in Chester, you know, that's hard work, and you always lose more than you win. I feel like,
Oh
and
boy.
that's like a real long-term crisis. And I will say this, one of the biggest frustrations is and this doesn't have as much to do with pollution, but at least in Pennsylvania, while the Department of Environmental Protection can take into account, what's the legal term? I'm embarrassed now. The existing disparate impacts.
Okay.
They can take that into account, but they're not required to. So, and I have talked to our Department of Environmental Protection about what tools they could use to not approve a building permit for a polluter in an area that's already hugely impacted. They said that the minute that we deny a permit because there are already a whole bunch of polluters there, we will get sued because
Oh boy.
they're not authorized to do that by our legislature, by our state legislature. And that is like one of the original sins, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Dr. Kramer, I don't remember your first name.
It's Ron.
Okay.
Hi, good afternoon.
Hi. Well, in response to Susan's question, I would just point to the larger effort to create a new international crime of ecocide. And that's been an ongoing effort for quite a few years now, and it's gained some steam in the international legal community. And so that might just be one thing to kind of look at and catch up on what's happening there. They've actually come up with specific definitions of ecocide. And of course, it's a tough road to go down to actually create such a international crime. And of course, the dominant geopolitical powers would ignore it anyhow. just like they ignore the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But nonetheless, I think it's an important symbolic and political effort to create
I do too.
a crime of ecocide.
It has to start somewhere, like
Yeah, yeah.
be built into
And
the ethos.
So Jenny, you have a question?
Just one last, kind of to tag on to what Ron said, and Melissa, I think you were asking, where the spaces are, but I've definitely heard of organizations. There's nonprofit organizations that are across the country, but I've also connected with organizations locally that haven't heard of resources like this. And they're in places where their funding or their project work is being compromised because they don't have the support that they need, or they're signing up and paying high dollar bills for their own legal support because they don't
Mm,
know that these kinds of things exist. And I think
Yep,
that
yep.
Lawyers for Good Government put out an ask in the middle of our work with them, to spread the word about what they were doing, because also the organization of community building organizations across the country can only, like, getting us all together to be more organized can only help the climate effort.
Totally. Yeah.
And people going it alone sometimes can do damage to the bigger picture if they're
Mhm.
not collaborating with other folks that are fighting against the same issue. So anyway, I think I would agree this is amazing, and it would be a resource that we would definitely share.
Okay, I had one question on As We Sow. Okay, they try to get corporations, shareholders involved with ESG. Do you know what their percentage of success is? And
I do not. So yeah, now to be fair, I have to say, because I didn't have a whole lot of time. And when I go to As You Sow, I usually go there to see what kind of job listings they have and any highlights of current like wins or different, or I'll see them in the press, different proposals that they were successful in getting to an annual vote. So what I've not done is like read their annual report.
okay,
And they have a lot of information on their website too. And I just didn't have the time to do a deep dive on As You Sow, but I I get a big smile on my face whenever I talk about them. I don't think I'm cool enough or smart enough to get a job at As You Sow, I've decided. Feel free to contact me if I'm happy to talk to anybody or
yeah,
anyone, any nonprofits you're suggesting as well.
okay.
Okay,
Thank you all.
you bet. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.